Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today I have with me a wonderful, wonderful guest. His name is Keith Goldthorpe. He's one of our brilliant team here at Cynozure. Pleasure to have you here, Keith. Thank you very much for coming along.
Thank you. It's my first podcast, so go easy on me.
I will go easy on you. We'll talk about something that you're passionate about. How about that?
Sure, sounds good.
So on which we want to have a kickabout of the topic data mesh, and more specifically kind of unpick data mesh as a framework for delivering sort of data-driven value at scale, to coin the phrase from the book about data mesh, because there's a bit of, there's some confusion about what it is. There's some excitement about what it is. So hopefully we could get a chance to kick about what it all means and unpick it in practice and reality of what it's all about. But before we do that, should we get you introduced? Great to hear a bit about, or tell the audience, because I know, of course, a bit about who you are, what you do here at Cynozure, but also some of your background. It'd be great to go through that first off.
Sure, thanks, Jason. Yeah, so I head up the solution architecture practice, which means I'm very client focused, and I'm working on systems and building things for customers day in, day out. So I like to think of myself as in the field. But in terms of my experience, I've been working on data systems for I think about 30 years now. I've kind of totted up. So I cut my teeth back in a large retailer back in the early 90s, and worked on a significant loyalty scheme, which was the kind of the first in the UK that generated a massive amount of customer data, and probably worked on one of the first UK data warehouse implementations. And again, that was kind of focused on customer data, but also how that information can inform your logistics and in effect all aspects of the operations. And that's kind of where I fell in love with data as an idea, and I've kind of stuck with that throughout my career for the rest of the time. I've done senior roles. I've been an enterprise architect. I've been a program manager, but always keep on coming back to the tech, right? So I kind of found my heartland now in being a senior solution architect, because that, as I said, that kind of keeps me connected to the reality of the thing. I worked in retail for many years, and then more recently some other industries, and then joined Jason and crew last year, which has kind of then opened up my exposure to a whole new set of industries and new ideas. But it's really interesting to see how some of the core common concepts of data platforms and data thinking just are totally transferable across industries. A data model is a data model, which whatever the entities are. So so I'm finding myself to have very transferable skills. And then obviously the topic of data mesh is coming up. It's quite modern, quite new thinking, but actually, again, I've got the perspective of 30 years, so I can see that some of the ideas that are being talked about have actually been around for quite some time. So it's there's nothing totally new under the sun. So we'll get into a little bit of that in a minute.
Yeah, for sure. And the experience in retail is quite interesting, I think, when you talk about transferable skills, because in some ways retail blazed the trail for data and large volumes of data, and sort of unpicking data and tailoring messages to customers, and using that information to drive all sorts of ranging decisions and demand planning and all that good stuff. And I think a lot of lessons can be learned from what the retailers were doing 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and still trying to do and still getting better at. But to have been involved in those early days.
That's a good thing about that. Large scale, direct feedback. It's very clear whether your ideas are working or not. You get immediate feedback. You do something stupid, you know about it straight away. You do something good, it goes really well. And of course, some of the larger retailers have got economies of scale, so you can and the opportunity to trial ideas on a small scale and then roll out the ones that are successful. So you get massive leverage. If you shave off 3 seconds at a till, that actually multiplies up to a massive difference overall to the efficiency of the organization. So it's a great learning ground, high volume, high pace, great feedback, very 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 measurable, and very very KPI centric. So a great sort of bedrock in how to do this sort of stuff.
Awesome. So you mentioned data mesh there at the sort of tail end of your when you're talking through your background. What is it? Let's start there. What is it in your eyes, in what you've read, in what you've talked about with people, in what you've sort of advised organizations on, just at a top level? What is data mesh for people that don't know?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing is to say it is not a technology, right? So data mesh is not a technology. It's not a thing that you can go to a vendor and buy. It's a mindset. It's an approach. It's much more about how you organize your teams and your structure than it is. Yeah, as I say, it's not a piece of kit you can just buy off the shelf. It's a mindset. But it kind of breaks down into four big ideas, I think, some of which sometimes people describe that as three ideas with one with two flavors, right? So, but the four big ideas are, first and foremost, this notion of the domain. So a domain is a right-sized collection of ideas and thoughts. So it's, related and self-contained. So it could be something like customer, or it could be something like product. And it's everything related to that, right? So, right. And I try and think of that as, when you're sizing a domain, it needs to be sort of the Goldilocks principle. Is it mustn't be too big and it mustn't be too small, right? So it's a good number of objects or ideas or concepts closely related to each other, and what you're looking for is a boundary. Something that could be identifiable as, right, there's the edge of product, right? Beyond this, we're no longer talking about product, we're talking about stock or something like that, right? So, so inventory, I think, would probably be another domain, right? So, and we'll come to how the domains are connected in a moment, right? So that's the first thing. First concept is a domain.
Right.
And the second concept, and this is the one that gets linked in with that, is that domain is a product. So you've got to adopt product thinking, right? And for me, that means the domain is, it's not just a collection. It's not a storage layer, right? It's not that you're just putting your data in a nice container, right? You're actually advocating that product for use throughout the organization. So almost you've got to sell the product internally. So if you are a domain owner, you have to be a product owner as well. And the utilization and the utility of your domain is your responsibility, right? And if no one's using your domain for anything good, that reflects on you, right? Your job is to market, if you like. You've got to market that data and that product and those services. And to do that, you probably need a high quality product, which means it's got to be, well designed, well structured. It's got to be a quality product. It's got to have great, user manual, right? It's got to have a manual that explains how to use it. It's got to be promoted and advertised and maybe, versioned even, right? So, if data were an iPhone, what does what's the iPhone 13 version of your domain, right? Are you constantly iterating it and improving it and making it better and telling people about the improvements, right? So as you publish new features, shout about it and say, look, here's a new shiny feature, right? And here's where you might use it, right? So that's kind of
and I guess metrics as well, like how much is it used, how often is it used, how fast is it, how many times does it fail, what breakages do we have, how many calls to the help desk to say it's not working, those sorts of things.
Yeah, exactly. If you thought about it as a product, how would you know if you had a successful product on your hands, right? You'd look at, if I'm selling a product, then the number of products I sell is really important measure, right? So if you take that analogy, right? So if I'm a domain owner and the number of accesses to my domain, how many times it's hit and how many times people consume it, is a really, really important measure, right? Yeah. If that's going down, then there's something wrong, right? Yeah. If it's going up, then something's going right? So absolutely, you can set KPIs around usage and quality, and you could do an NPS score, a net promoter score. You could ask your consumers,
how good is my domain?
How much would you rate? How likely are you to recommend this domain to other people in the organization, right? And if my net promoter score is negative, then dig in and find out why. And it could be, oh yeah, great product, terrible documentation, right? So yeah, I think it's good, but I can't work out how to use it, right? Or yeah, it's fantastic in terms of content, but the performance is terrible, right? Or it's very buggy, or it's very, or when I need it at 3 a.m., it's not there, right? So, so if you think in terms of product mindset, you'll be getting the right notion of what a domain actually is. So, that's why I couple those two things together sometimes, because the domain defines the boundary and sort of describes the product, but the product thinking is what makes it into a good product.
Yeah. Got it.
So those are kind of the front of house ideas. And then there's a couple of others that are sort of a bit more behind the scenes, right? One is infrastructure as a service, right? So this is, again, if you think in terms of you're the domain owner, you don't want to be spending your time and your energy thinking about and administering tech, right? So things like infrastructure, the storage, the compute, the back-end, security layer, the backplane, all of the stuff that is needed needs not to be your concern, right? So the idea of data mesh is you federate all of that away, you push that to another infrastructure team, or more likely, you sublet that to a cloud provider, right? So your cloud takes care of infrastructure, right? And as a domain owner, I kind of assume infinite compute and infinite storage. There'll be a bill somewhere, and you might do some internal wooden dollars apportioning of cost and things like that. But again, if my domain is valuable, then I and the organization can stomach the cost of all of that usage, right? Who wouldn't want 1 million hits a second? Yes, that costs you in infrastructure, but demonstrably you're getting values. So that scalability, should pay for itself, but it needs not to be the domain owner's concern. And that done well, I think that would create one of the challenges with data mesh will be how to stop it from being just independent data marts. How do we make it so that it isn't just little teams inside departments just doing their own thing? And one of the ways that would be achieved is by pushing the infrastructure to a centralized function and say, right, actually, we're all going to use the same. We're all going to use the same storage tier, and one day we might change where that storage tier is, to a more high performant one, or a cheaper one, or a better one in some regard in terms of recoverability and backup and archive and all those kinds of things. But the day that happens, the domains wouldn't know, right? It's not their concern, right? That's happening behind a curtain. Okay. So that's infrastructure as a service. And then the final thing, which is probably the one that's sort of hardest to grasp, and I think is that it's very much about the organization, and I see different companies tackling this in different ways, and it depends very much on what the existing culture is, on how this will be adopted, but it's federated governance, right? So this is this idea of how do we govern the whole thing, right? So one of the principles of data mesh is autonomy, right? So as a domain owner, I am free to do my own thing to a degree, right? So I can, and as I say, take that product thinking, I'm responsible for making the product good. And in order to do that, I need to plow my own furrow, right? I need to do my own thing, and not be constrained by some central committee, right? But how do you keep good governance? How do you keep all of the domains to a similar standard? How do you make them interoperable? How do you prevent domains from sort of competing over product areas, right? So I talked there before about product and inventory, right? Actually, both might want a bit of each other's patch, right? And especially if one was strong and one was weak, then you might find product overreaching itself and saying, oh, actually, I'll take on a bit of the responsibility of inventory. That would probably be wrong, right? So who's going to determine where the boundaries are, and who's going to decide who gets to do what? That's this idea of federated governance, right? Which I really see as being a kind of a council of representation from all of the domains, right? So each domain sort of promote somebody to represent them at the, if you like, the UN of domains, right? We all come together, we talk about, our successes and our failures, we look to each other's best practice and learn from each other, and agree a common standard, right? A common approach, and go, oh yeah, okay, there's an enhancement. It's been developed over in this domain. It actually makes things better. So we'll adopt that improvement across all of the others, right? So, and that's, yeah.
So what's all that for? So I think that unpicks what it is. Like what did I say? This is the headline when we came in, and that I took from the Data Mesh book by Jamak, was the framework for data-driven value at scale. Like that's, you can kind of understand that it's getting value at scale, but what's it for, and what's caused the need for something like this?
Yeah, why would you want
to do data mesh?
Yeah.
What problems would you have to go, right, data mesh is what I'm going to go for, or parts of data mesh,
Yeah, so I think the first problem it aims to solve is that one of scalability, right? So the presumption is that if you've taken what then would be considered a more traditional sort of data warehouse approach, where you've got a central team and a central platform, and you've spent all of your time, connecting to all of your source systems, pulling that data through into a central platform, organizing it, structuring it, whatever design approach you've taken. You might have taken a dimensional modeling approach. You might have done data vault. You might have done, you might be then branching out into concepts like data lake and also all of these kinds of things, right? But all of those have in common that the presumption that centralizing data is the start point and is a good idea to create the enterprise view, right? So you're looking for reuse, you're looking for standardization, you're looking for economies of scale, you're looking for consistency, right? So one way to create consistency is to only have one copy of the data. Now, the problem with that is you're putting a lot of pressure on one central team and a very high expectation of understanding. Mm-hmm. So that one central team kind of has the scope of the whole company.
Yeah.
And they have to be an expert in everything. Right? I need to deeply understand how finance works. I need to be a marketeer. I need to be a logistics expert. I need to be a customer service specialist. I need to be, strategist. And also, by the way, you also need to kind of interrogate log files and what have you, right? So your expectation as a team, and sometimes there's some key individuals within those teams, is you have to know everything, right? Yeah. And when a system, and when a data warehouse has matured, it might well have thousands of tables in it, and that is too much for any one mortal to understand. And so the idea is that at that point, development will slow, if not stop, right? Because it'll be groaning under its own weight, and any change is there are many things to consider, right? I can't change that because it'll impact on that, because it'll impact on that, and you know what, it's all too difficult. And by the way, we've got 5 years worth of legacy reporting sitting on top of all of this, which will all be very fragile and break if we try and reorganize and restructure things, right? So the idea there is, don't get into that problem, right? So break up your monolith before it groans under its own weight.
It sort of feels a little bit like the self-service for data rather than self-service for when people normally talk about analytics and insight and dashboards. But it's kind of, that's about federating the ability to get and do insights and then use that insights to make decisions. This is almost federating out, democratizing out the ownership and management and leadership of, as you say, domains and their associated products for it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I suppose if I was going to think of an analogy, maybe a food analogy might be one. I would say, maybe a data warehouse is like a restaurant kitchen. I place an order and the chef or the team of chefs, cooks my food, right? And, there'll be standard meals that are available, so I can order off the menu, but that you can order some special meal. If you've got a dietary requirement or whatever, you can ask for something special, and an individual will prep that for you and make that happen for you. So you can still have bespoke order, but more often than not, you're kind of eating off the menu, right? And the restaurant is geared up to serving the menu, right? So if you ask for something special, guess what? You might have to wait for it, right? Whereas if you order off the menu, probably the food will come out fairly quickly, right? Yeah. What I think with data mesh is, the analogy there would be a bit more like, it's more like a self-service buffet, something like that, right? Where you go into one of those kind of food halls where there's foods of all the cuisines from around the world, and you can wander around and go, oh, I fancy a bit of this and a bit of this and a bit of this. It's all been sort of prepped by a specialist, right?
So you then curate it yourself onto your plate.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So if, and if I want, chips and sweet and sour, I can have chips and sweet and sour, right? That's not something that's ever been put on anyone's menu, but the chips are really good. The sweet and sour sauce is really nice. And, I put it together and that works for me. And that's my requirement. So in that sense, it is self-serve, but there's a processing, there's a preparation layer between me, the consumer, and the production, right? But that way you can imagine, if that was a big, buffet style, one of those eateries where, serves 500 people an hour, that sort of thing, right? Under that scale, you can afford completely to have one of the best, Indian chefs in the land, right? Because that one specialist is producing high quality Indian food. If you ask that person then to go off and, cook the Chinese banquet, they'll be like, that's not really my thing. I don't really know much about that. Yes, I'm a chef, but really I'm a specialist, right? And that notion of the domain is very much like that, right? I'm good at marketing. I really understand the marketing environment. I know the marketing systems. I know the needs of the marketing data. So that's my specialism. I know that stuff really, really well. If you transplant me over into logistics, I'm going to, I've
got a learning curve.
I can give it a go, but I don't actually know what I'm talking about yet. Right? It will take some time for me to pick up that knowledge.
So is this for everyone? Should everyone be thinking about data mesh? It feels like there's, just as you're going through, that explanation and those components that you talked about, the 4 components at the start, it sort of feels like not everyone will have the issues that require that solution. But am I right there? Is this for everyone? Is there certain scenarios where this makes sense to think about data mesh, and or actually is, do you need to be a bit careful about going, data mesh is the new thing, let's just crack on and implement it?
Yeah, I think it probably is more appropriate for organizations that have already achieved a certain scale and a certain maturity. I don't really think there's much. There aren't really many sort of greenfield operations left, if you like. I don't think.
Well, startups, I suppose. If you're going from scratch, then then you have the opportunity to because this isn't just about. I think actually one point. I think what you're saying is, isn't really just about how you design your data warehouse and your analytics platform. This is a sort of an enterprise wide. I think this plays into the design of your applications, or certainly the ownership of the applications that create the data, customer domain, what's our customer systems and analytics downstream. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And the original work talks about narrowing the gap between the operational and the analytical plane, right? Yeah. So where does that expertise come from, right? So again, we take HR or finance or whatever, so like if you want to present a domain called HR, the best people to contribute to that are the people who manage and operate and run the HR systems, right? They are the people with the absolute best understanding of those inputs. I'll come on to the kind of 3 tiers in a moment. Ask me about 3 tiers of three types of trades in a second, right? So,
okay.
Your question about is this for everyone? If you were a startup, would you orientate in mesh style? I think you might. It would depend on your intended scale. But I think you could take some of the principles of mesh without necessarily forming several teams. So you could say, actually, as a startup, we are still going to have a data team, and it in itself is going to be small and well
broken down by domain, though.
Yeah, but still with that product mindset. So this small team, small but capable and smart team, is still going to think in terms of products and domains. And I was saying before about there's nothing new under the sun, right? A well architected and well structured data warehouse has zones, subject areas that of similar concept, right? So if you work with me, you wouldn't be surprised to find that I'll break up a data warehouse into identifiable sections for understanding and for access control and things like that. We talked about before that warehouse with 1,000 tables is not appropriate for anyone really to have access to all of it. So I would always encourage people to present a simplified view and hand out parts of the warehouse in modules and say, right, you've been granted access to core common reference, right? In there, you'll find a calendar object and maybe a product catalog or whatever, some simple generic, reference objects that everyone needs. But you've also been granted your specialist area, right? So subject matter areas in a model is not new, right? But yeah, absolutely. I think, for more established companies where they already have a data warehouse, maybe they think it's already, it's doing quite well, it's achieving the outcomes, you're driving value out of it. They think it's, responsive and adaptive, it's highly performant, and it's going really well. Is there a need to change to this? Would you re-architect? I think it comes down to, are you seeing the pace of improvement slow? Right? Yeah. So if things are beginning to slow down, and the early gains you used to get, are not actually, that feeling's gone a little bit, the enthusiasm's gone, it now feels a bit like a trudge. That's probably the time to start thinking about breaking things up a bit, right? And it's, so I think for established companies, it's a level of maturity. I think the other thing is, I personally can't conceive of doing this not on the cloud. I think the obligations of that infrastructure as a service element, I think if you were trying to do that for yourself, you'd just be spending way, way, way too much effort and time trying to sort out the back plane. Right. So if you're not currently on the cloud, I would say, I would say the more urgent task is migrate your data system to the cloud rather than worry about implementing mesh in situ, right? So that would be my advice, right?
You can move to mesh en route, can't you?
Yeah,
set up in that mode in the cloud.
Absolutely, yeah. So you might do that as in one step. Planner. We're gonna migrate, and in doing so, we're gonna migrate, architecturally and structurally within the teams, right? So, but again, you might want to think about what roles are you going to put in some kind of central function. Do you want 12 data modelers? Probably not, right? It's probably not a good idea to have too many of these super specialist skills distributed. So think about the roles that you will will have in the product teams, and which ones might be in a centralized piece. That's not really in the original work, but I think the federated governance, just you probably need a chair, you probably need a central core that's still taking ownership for the overall roadmap and the overall communication strategy and things like that, right? How are you going to sell this to these concepts to a wider audience? You probably still need some central leadership, I would think.
Yeah. So I mean, you talk there about sort of where it's most appropriate. How's this playing out in conversations that we're having with, organizations who are considering this, have read about it, want to understand it a bit more? How's it kind of manifesting itself? Because with all these, I'll call it new concepts, but you've mentioned it's sort of, some of this is about iterating and evolving things that already exist. But with these new concepts, people kind of jump to them, and it's got a lot of press, and it's got a lot of sort of mind share in the industry, and it's getting some good, some good discussion. So are people going, God, we got to go there, and then the gig is, figure out how we get there? Or is it more, I want to understand this thing and to see whether it's appropriate, or some kind of place in between?
Yeah, so I think that, a lot of the conversations I'm having in the moment are, I've heard of it, but I don't understand what it is. Can you explain it to me, so that we can understand whether it is, like you say, it's getting a lot of energy, it's getting a lot of traction. A lot of the vendors are talking about it as the next big thing, right? So at the moment, there's a kind of inquiry as to what it is. I think where it's a bit more advanced, where people are sort of saying, actually, we're doing this, can you help us, refine it and iterate it towards our particular circumstances? That seems to be coming out in financial services more than anything. Which I guess that's where, there's scale, there's pace, there's investment. They've got the ability to invest in this kind of thinking, and they have the scale and the need, particularly with things like ESG coming up and being very, transformative in financial services. That's a kind of a new.
And the fact that sorry to cut in, and the fact that they're regulated, because of course a lot of the regulation is about transparency and being able to show how you're in control and that you're doing the right thing. Does this help with that sort of transparency, remove the kind of black box nature of how we do data?
Yes, to a degree. I mean, I think it could be seen as sort of replacing one big black box with several slightly smaller black
bit
boxes.
Of a watch out. Yeah.
But those smaller units are meant to be, high quality, right? So they're meant to be very well documented, particularly at the boundary, right? So where the black box piece might come in is there'll be some innards, there'll be some things inside the domain, which is about how is that information sort of presented, that might be obscured from the outside. But if you think of it as a function and say, right, this thing is responsible for providing this information, and here is a good document explaining what this information is and what its lineage is, then I think that opens up to more scrutiny in terms of regulation. Absolutely. Yeah. So that could be one reason for that. Again, that notion of lineage talked about before, that kind of those three flavors of domain.
Oh yeah. Tell me about the 3 tiers, Keith. You told me to do that. So there you go.
So one way to kind of organize the mesh is with alignments, right? So certain domains are aligned to source systems, certain domains are aligned to consumers, and then that leaves you a bit in the middle. And how do you translate from the source aligned world to the consumer aligned world? Now in the original book, that gets referred to as the aggregate layer. I personally find that a little bit confusing, because the word aggregation can mean many things in the data game, right? So I've been referring to that more as like an intermediate layer. But its purpose is to kind of promote reuse and be those common points where lots of things contribute. If you take an example of something like customer cannot and is not owned by one operational system. So, if we take a retail example, right, where does customer live, right? Well, I might have signed up to the marketing, I might have said, send me some information about your goods and services, right? So I'm on the marketing list, right? So marketing have me, but I'm also buying stuff, right? So I'm a shopper. So maybe I've done some ordering online, right? So the online system knows about me, but maybe it's a bricks and mortar as well. So I go into a shop, I maybe brandish my loyalty card, right? So retail knows about me as well. I phone up and make a complaint, right? So customer service and customer service management knows about me as well. So all these operational systems have a piece of me. Not one of them can say that they own the customer, but wouldn't it be really great if something did exist that stitched all of that together and said, actually, if you wanted a holistic view of the customer experience, you'd need a customer domain, right? And that would feed from a lot of those source systems, right? Now, where might you use customer? Well, actually, customer is probably one of those middle layer pieces, right? Because it's actually some of the outbound, so retail itself that might then come back and say, actually, give me a better view of my customer. Right? I saw their in-store transactions, but it's really important to know that this really high value customer is currently in dispute about service, right? So, the last time they spent X thousand pounds on a sofa or whatever, and we delivered it with damage, that's a problem, and we haven't yet resolved it for them. That's a terrible time to try and sell them a new sofa, right? So, so being joined up and understanding those kinds of things, those are the kind of the consumer layer pieces, right?
Right.
And, absolutely, I see data mesh as being as operational as it is analytical. Right, so those consumer domains could easily form parts of operational systems. It isn't a data mesh is not about here's a clever way of doing reporting systems. It's way more broader than that. Right, it's absolutely meant to be deeply embedded in the whole organization. And we hear
why are vendors jumping on this? It doesn't sound like you said at the start, this isn't technology. Is it because of the buzz, or is there a genuine problem that technology can solve? I mean, I can think of technology, bits of technology that might help with the things that you've explained, but you've got a number of vendors going, data mesh, but what's the story there? Why are they getting behind it?
At the moment, there's one sort of area of tech that's jumping on mesh, and I think they see an opportunity here and see a kind of a potential problem with mesh that they think they can solve, which is virtualization. So what they're recognizing is that if you break up your data into several components, actually, if you're the kind of person like a data scientist or a report analyst or somebody who's naturally sitting over a couple of domains, or even, suppose you were responsible for some mega KPI pack for the board, you have to report on all of the operations and all of the services, if you have to stitch data across the whole organization together, mesh could be a bit of a problem for you, actually, because it done badly, it could mean actually I now have to interoperate with 12 connections and they don't talk to each other nicely. They all use different standards and approaches and things like that, right? So the virtualization vendors are seeing that as a potential problem and saying, right, well, we can now put a single pane of glass over all of this and stitch it back together again, right? So if I'm a data scientist and I need access to this information, I can go through the virtualization layer and I've got a single connection, single point, and everything's there for me. So that's, I think that's opportunistic. The vendors I would really like to see adopt mesh and turn it into a plug and play type solution where tools and services for domain owners were just packaged up nicely and made that a way less sort of technical capability is the cloud providers, right? And I think they will, if mesh kind of continues to become a popular and adopted way, I think we'll see over time fewer and fewer sort of homegrown attempts and more productized versions from the cloud vendors, just like we did with Data Lake. So Data Lake initially was born out of open source, and it is that move towards using, still remember the phrase big data, right? so I don't know if big data has been and gone, right? So, but the concept of the data lake was born around that kind of time where storage became commoditized and cheap. But initially, data lakes were kind of on premise and managed by central teams. They were still putting kit in machine holes, and yes, it was cheaper to go to a higher scale, but there's still a lot of effort associated with just administering, the kit behind the lake. Then the cloud vendors came along, and you can go to AWS or Azure or GCP right now, and you can just click,
Switch it on.
build lake, right? And there it is, right? You've got a lake and you can start using it within minutes, right? And all of that infrastructure has just been taken care of by somebody else, right? So I'll know that mesh has sort of really taken off and it's become mainstream when I can go to one of those cloud providers and go to their marketplace and say, click mesh, right? Open mesh, and in the mesh add domain, and there it is. When I create a domain, I simply name what the domain is. I put a little blurb about its responsibilities. I connect, I nominate a domain owner. So I'm the product owner. So I as the domain owner, have some special privileges, and I can do what I can do as an owner. And that includes governing who can see my domain, right? Who's participating, and what are the kind of access levels you as somebody in the ecosystem have on my domain, right? So I could grant you read only access to my domain and say, right, yeah, you can read this, but you can't write to it, whereas somebody else, you might say, give full, if you like, administrative access to the domain, right? So the developers within the domain are specialist resources within it, right? So that's my call to action for the industry, right?
Well, I was going to say, just free advice to the product managers at the cloud providers to put on the backlog.
At least put the button. At least do the button, right? Put a button. Put the button. See if people click it. See if people click it. That'll give you a
proper MVP. So you touched a little bit then about where you think vendors might go, sort of more broadly, I guess, to and just to start thinking about wrapping up. Where does data mesh, whilst is getting a lot of limelight, is early. The book that Zhamek wrote is only just released, the last full version last few weeks. It's in some ways an academic book because it's a collection of ideas that have been pulled together, and it's only being it's only now being implemented in its entirety, or in parts. So it is early days, right? It's early days for it. It's burgeoning. Where does it go? Do you think it sort of going to continue as mesh? Do you think other things like it will spawn? We hear people saying, do I go data fabric or data mesh, or how are those things? Are they the same? So where does this go, do you think?
Yeah, it's a tricky one to predict, right? So is it because if it is a way of organizing your teams and your company, it's a harder thing to say I have it, right? So some of the things that have preceded it, have I adopted a data lake? Yeah, I have, right? It's pretty clear cut. It's a clear cut thing. It's tangible. I've got one, right? So have I implemented it well? Have I done it the way other people are doing it? Yes, no, maybe, right? So, but you can very tangibly point at it and say there it is, right? Mesh isn't quite as simple as that, and because it's more of an organizational structure thing, you could say, well, we've adopted some of the ideas, but we haven't completed the journey yet. So are we truly mesh? Well, are you mesh because you've declared product thinking, or are you mesh because you've separated your teams into domains, or are you mesh because you've abstracted your infrastructure, or are you mesh because you've got a fully functioning federated governance council? At what point could you?
Maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, right? I think that's the thing with a framework like this, isn't it? You can take the bits that work for you, and as long as you package them up together and they deliver value, who cares whether it's called mesh or not?
Exactly right. And if I don't know how long this podcast lasts for, right? So it's 2022 at the moment. If you're listening,
yes, true, yeah.
If you're listening to this in 2027, right, the word mesh may no longer be being talked about, right? That might have been a phrase that came and went.
Yeah.
But if you take the parallels with software development, software went through this similar kind of breakup, right? So back in the day we used to have monolithic systems, big balls of mud, one database to rule all things, and software realized that doesn't scale and went through service oriented architecture, right? So now we talk about microservices, and again, if you're listening to this in 2027, can anyone remember microservices? That's been replaced by a new term, hasn't it? Nanoservices or something, I don't know. So will we still be talking about mesh in 5 years' time? I don't know, but I think the notion of
concepts will live
distributed
on.
Compute and domain specialism, well, absolutely, I think we will, right? So I think it does solve those problems of the scalability and understandability and ownership as well, right? So fundamentally, one of the debates we have with customers is, what is the role of a data owner? When we talk about data management, data governance, one of the things we strongly advocate is people to take responsibility and accountability for the data and its quality. In the world of mesh, the accountability for quality is, very clear, right? I'm very clear about who is responsible for the quality of the domain, and is the domain owner, right? There's no debate. If you own the domain and the data quality is poor, it's your problem. Solve it, right? Yeah. And it may be that your inputs are poor quality, and that's the reason why you've got a quality issue. Then that's why you need your federated governance, because you go to your council and say, look, I've got a problem and it's caused by these source systems, domains, source domains. So we need to fix this, right? And you, domain owner of system X, you've got a job to do, right? Because you're impacting on me, right? And we think it's all important. So it solves a lot of those kinds of problems. I reckon, there's a reason this is getting good buzz, right? Because deeply, it's a very well thought out notion, and it's learned from a lot of history. I don't think it overstates itself, but it is a good idea.
Great. Brilliant. Well, I knew a little bit before we spoke. Now I feel like I know a little bit more. But no, thanks, Keith. That's been it's been great. And as you say, it's early days for the industry. We've got to grips with it, understood it, understand it to a certain degree. We're talking to organizations about which bits make sense, how quickly to move, and those sorts of things. So, but it is early days, and let's talk again in 2027 and do a retro on
we'll revisit
the reload. Yeah. But no, thanks very much for coming onto the show, Keith. Really, really appreciate it. And always good to talk to you, and even better on a podcast. So I hope I went easy on you, and you did great for the first one. So appreciate you coming on the show.
That's great. Thank you.
No worries. And thanks everyone for listening. I hope that you found that useful, and we'll catch you again soon.